Okay, we are now recording. Awesome. So welcome again, everyone, to today's Association for Adult Development and Aging webinar, Where Did These Wounds Come From? A conversation about the complexity of intergenerational and personal trauma in communities of color with Dr. Charmayne R. Adams. As the webinar commences, you may type any questions you have for Dr. Adams in the chat box, and they will be answered at the end of today's webinar. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Adams. Dr. Charmayne R. Adams is an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha and an independently licensed professional counselor. Her clinical background focuses on working with individuals with a history of trauma or in crisis. Her research focuses on teaching about trauma, systemic and emotion-focused clinical interventions, and the application of attachment theory in clinical and academic settings. Both clinically and academically, Dr. Adams is focused on social justice counseling and empowering clients to examine barriers and use their strengths to overcome life's changes. With no further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Charmayne R. Adams.
Wonderful, thank you all. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen real quick so that you can see my face. You can see who I am before we start just doing slides for the rest of the presentation. So welcome everybody, it's so wonderful to see you. You can see me now, but I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen and we'll go from there. All right. So, like Janelle said, my name is Charmayne Adams, Dr. Adams. I've been at the University of Nebraska now going on my, this is the second year that I've been here. I've also worked in a lot of different clinical settings, which I think is helpful to give you a frame of reference on my clinical experience. I've worked in inpatient residential treatment facilities. I've worked in inpatient hospitals. I've worked in mobile crisis. I've worked in the correctional system, and now I work in private practice, primarily working with individuals with marginalized identities, whether that's race, ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation. Regardless of the setting, I've continued to come back to attachment theory and a biological understanding of stress response to really understand what's happening with my clients in crisis or with a history of trauma. And so I think it's important for y'all to know the lens, the direction that I'm coming from with this. And I've found for myself, kind of from a theory lens, that emotionally focused therapy, which has been the work of Sue Johnson, has been really helpful in helping me conceptualize this. But of course, whatever theoretical orientation you practice from, I think this information will be widely applicable to you. So I'd like to start out by just saying thank you. Thank you to the Association for Adult Development and Aging. Thank you to Janelle for putting this all together and being the brains behind orchestrating this, and for Dr. Christian Chan for helping, and the rest of the Professional Development Committee. I deeply appreciate being asked to talk about this important topic, and the invitation really speaks loudly about the priorities of this division. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I really look forward to the webinars that are to come and all the different activities. I think this is an important conversation, and I hope this is just the beginning of it. So there are three main objectives for this presentation. The first is I just want you all to broadly understand how intergenerational trauma and resilience can be transmitted across generations. That's a pretty complex process, and so if we can walk away from that 60 minutes with a foundational understanding of that, I think we'll be in good shape. Next, I want you to understand a little bit of the complexity of how personal trauma and intergenerational trauma can play off, build, and really distort the way that we interpret things that are a stressor to us and the way we respond to things that are a stressor to us. And then finally, I'd love if we could all walk away from this with an understanding of how to empower our clients and work from a culturally responsive lens, especially when we're working with clients in crisis or with a history of trauma. So I think it's fair to talk sometimes a little bit about the limits of this presentation. And so as much as I love 60-minute presentations, I think that time is definitely a factor here. And so I'm going to try my best to get through as much as we can, but talking about foundational knowledge, integration, and application in 60 minutes is just a really tall order. And so I hope that you walk away from this with plenty of directions to go in, but and feel really empowered to continue doing whatever research you need to. You'll also get a lot of resources from me, so you can continue the areas that you feel like were most interesting to you from this presentation. Next, the format of this, I think I love Zoom. It offers a lot of flexibility and accessibility, but also really limits our way to interact. And so I know Janelle is going to be helping moderate questions that are happening in the chat. And so my hope is to finish with enough time by the end so that we can, so that I can answer some questions. And then finally, prior knowledge. That is the hard part about presentations given to the general community, is that we're all coming from different places. For some of you, this information may feel really basic. For others, this may feel quite novel. We're all coming from different starting points. And so I really hope that everyone finds information useful for them, regardless of this is brand new or not. So let's get started, folks. We're going to start with some definitions so that we can all get on the same page about what we're talking about. Then we're going to specifically move into talking about intergenerational and personal traumas, what types of experiences may constitute those types of traumas, and what are the typical responses to those. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between trauma-informed and trauma-specific care, and then end with moving into talking about strength and resilience and practical implications. So I wanted to start today with a quote from Resmaa Mannikin, which is an LCSW who is a prominent voice when we're talking about intergenerational trauma, and especially when we're talking about the body-based experience of trauma. So this quote reads, "Our bodies don't care about logic, truth, or cognitive experience. They care about safety and survival. They care about responding to a perceived threat, even when that threat is not real." So as we move through this presentation, I want us to remember that our work as counselors isn't just cognitive, it isn't just emotional, because the human experience isn't just cognitive and emotional, it's biological. So yes, as humans, we've evolved to the point where most of our lives don't revolve around finding shelter and food and safety, but that isn't true for everyone, and that doesn't mean that those biological mechanisms have disappeared. So working in the land of crisis and trauma means that we're working with really deeply embedded biological systems that we're working exactly how they should be working. There's a beauty and an efficiency in these deeply ingrained systems that for me makes this work extremely interesting and really rewarding, but for clients can make them feel like they have no idea what's happening to them because their bodies are running on autopilot, and an autopilot that's been ingrained for generations and generations. So it can make them feel like they're out of control or that their response is out of context. So part of what we can do is we can help clients understand the biological mechanisms that are at play here. And that's part of our work as trauma and crisis counselors, is to understand that in a way that we can actually talk to our clients about it. So let's start off with some definitions. So first, the term communities of color is really broad and very vague. When I was thinking about the title for this, I was bouncing back and forth with my partner about what it should be. And I'm like, man, as soon as I say communities of color, like someone's gonna come for me for being so broad and being so vague. But in general, when I'm speaking about communities of color, I'm talking about non-white communities. And I don't want to fall down this rabbit hole talking about who constitutes who's white and who's not, because we know over the course of the United States, those groups have fluctuated. And so I don't want to fall down that really complicated rabbit hole in conversation. That's beyond the scope of this presentation. And this is typically not my preferred way of describing people because it's so broad, and we lose a lot of the nuances embedded in individual culture and in communities. I choose this for this presentation because one consistent factor across communities of color in the United States is that they've experienced generations of oppression and marginalization. And so that is the piece of this that the foundation that we're resting on. So whether we're talking about Black or African American or Asian or Native American or multiracial communities, the piece of that, what we really want to pull out is that intergenerational experience of oppression and marginalization. The next piece that I want us to be on the same page about is intergenerational trauma. And so this is sometimes referred to as historical trauma or transgenerational trauma. And this includes all events that are so widespread that an entire culture and future generations are impacted. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on intergenerational traumas that rupture the foundation of a community and purposely dismantle traditional ways of being. Okay. And so this can include atrocities like the Holocaust, like the enslavement of Africans and indigenous communities, like the imprisonment of Central and Latin American individuals or Japanese Americans in internment camps. So these types of events that were systematically used to create fear and create a loss of identity that impacts future generations. And those are the key components that we're looking for in intergenerational trauma. We're not just looking for experiences that create fear or terror in the present. We're looking at incidents that actually rupture, right? Rupture pieces of identity that would have, if the incident wouldn't have happened, would have been passed down from generation to generation. The next definition is personal traumas. So personal trauma is a term that I am using, and this is going to include traumatic incidents that the client has experienced within their lifetime. So when we're talking about intergenerational trauma, we're talking about potentially trauma responses that are coming from experiences that our client hasn't directly had. When we're talking about personal traumas, I want to talk about instances that the client has experienced within their lifetime. And so we'll expand on this later in the presentation because there are multiple types of trauma that we can directly experience, and they have really distinguishing characteristics and how people typically respond to them, which can be helpful for us as clinicians to know and understand. And then the last piece that I want us to get on the same page about is coping strategies. So these are the creative ways that clients use to manage their discomfort. And not just clients, all of us use them. Coping strategies can be both individual and community level. They are a broader subset of self-regulation processes. Okay? So our coping strategies are our collective effort to regulate our emotions, our cognitions, our behavior, our physiological experience, and environment in response to a stressor. So I think sometimes we throw around this word of like coping strategies, or our clients like show up to counseling and they're like, how about you just give me the coping strategies? And it's like, well, we all already have coping strategies, right? And they work at varying levels of effectiveness. And so I think the beginning conversation for our clients, especially our clients that are using coping strategies that have been passed down from generation to generation, is to talk about how they became embedded and how their effectiveness can change over time. Okay. All right. So every time, without fail, that I've done a talk about communities of color, there is always some comment, either made publicly or privately, that I shouldn't just be talking about communities of color because mental health issues impact everybody. And I don't argue that as a whole, we have a lot to do to improve the equity of care for all individuals seeking services. But due to historical and current systematic and individual racially motivated trauma, in addition to access to care issues, this requires us to look specifically at communities of color. So folks don't just wake up and say, man, I'm really looking forward to going to my counseling appointment and not trusting my therapist today, right? Like that's not something people just wake up and say. So if we have whole communities of people that don't have access or don't seek out services or aren't getting the care that they need or deserve, or end up leaving our services prematurely, this is a profession issue, right? We need to take responsibility for our part in creating a system that isn't meeting a need of certain communities, and the role we've played in creating and perpetuating a dynamic that makes communities of color feel like we aren't trustworthy. It's not our place to show up and say, you should trust us because I have this fancy degree or because I went to this professional development, right? Like we need to be doing the work to repair, because it didn't just wake up one day and happen that these communities didn't have access to care. We systematically didn't show up for these communities for generations, right? And so now we're trying to do that reparative work, but I think it's important for us as a profession that we don't shift the blame onto the victim, onto these communities. And we really take responsibility for what we've done in our current context in mental health care and what historically mental health care has done to communities of color. So that's why our conversation is focusing on them. All right, so let's start our conversation by taking a deeper dive into intergenerational trauma. I want to start this section with a quote from SAMHSA. They have a treatment improvement protocol. It's called a TIP, and it's tip number 57. And this one focuses on trauma-informed care and behavioral health systems. If this is an area of interest to you, SAMHSA has treatment improvement protocols in a wide variety of specialty areas. And essentially, it's like a very comprehensive lit review put into a manual format. And so you can have access to both the lit review side of it with all of their resources, and you can have access to the manualized piece of it. Sometimes they'll just give it to you in a PDF, and other times they'll actually mail you a physical copy of it. But the treatment improvement protocol, I pulled a lot from that for this presentation and is a really great place to start. Those are all housed on the SAMHSA website. So this says the effects of trauma like genocide, slavery, and internment in concentration camps can stress across generations. Stories, coping behaviors, and stress reactions can cross generational lines far removed from the actual events or firsthand accounts. Known as historical trauma, this type of trauma can affect the functioning of families, communities, and culture for multiple generations. So I want to draw specific attention to the stories, coping behaviors, and stress reactions component of this definition, because these are the mechanisms that we're looking at that impact people across generations. And that's why the literature on intergenerational trauma spans many different disciplines, because in counseling, we primarily have focused on the coping strategies. In the biology field, they've primarily focused on the stress reactions. In anthropology and sociology, they've primarily focused on the community level transmission of intergenerational trauma. So when we're looking at the literature on intergenerational trauma, we're actually spanning many different disciplines to really understand the mechanisms of how trauma and trauma response passes across generations. So when we're talking about the transmission of trauma, that can be a little misleading. What we're really talking about with intergenerational trauma is the transmission of our ability to perceive and respond to threats being passed from one generation to the next. So we're not actually talking about like trauma memories being transmitted across generations. We're talking about these felt sense ways of coping that are being passed across generations. So there are different ways to think about how these stories, coping behaviors, and stress reactions are passed from one generation to the next. The first way we can think about it is in that stories way. So there are many ways of conceptualizing and understanding intergenerational trauma and how these experiences impact a generation that does not directly experience them. I also want to note that this goes against everything psychologists originally thought needed to happen to meet PTSD criteria. And we'll talk a little bit about the PTSD diagnosis, but that A criteria in PTSD diagnosis talks about you needing to be able to directly experience the threat, right? Or feel a lived feeling of the threat. So when we start venturing into the land of intergenerational trauma, when we're talking about people responding to threats that they've actually had no direct exposure to, like that they're generations away from, we're starting to kind of see where this may butt against our ability to effectively use the PTSD diagnosis to work with these populations. There's one more factor to keep in mind when we're conceptualizing someone responding to a traumatic event. So from a sociological and anthropological perspective, these large-scale traumas impact the way that rituals, beliefs, and community-specific practices are passed from one generation to the next. So the loss of these through generations causes a disconnection from your cultural roots and weakens someone's connection to their community and to their family. This type of social isolation and rupture in the generational passing of knowledge can be a risk factor for how somebody responds to a traumatic event in the present day. So let's take an example of this. So let's say we have two clients, one that has a really deep understanding of their culture and a connection to their family and to their community. We have another client that doesn't have a very thorough understanding of their cultural background, isn't very involved in their community due to their parents or grandparents experiencing displacement from their homes, a loss of family traditions, or forced assimilation and both of them experience the same traumatic event. The second clients may experience exacerbated symptoms in response to trauma because of the cumulative effect of intergenerational trauma and the loss of those cultural community level responses to coping with traumatic events. So we can see how in a beautiful documentary that PBS just put out about the Black community in churches, I think is also a wonderful example of this. Talking about how the church turned into the place for the Black community of where social services are embedded, of where childcare is embedded, of where education comes from, of where you're learning all of these different types of life skills. So when we see individuals purposely target Black churches, right, as to create terror, to create fear, to create destruction, we see people that are systematically trying to target spaces that are going to impact the ability to pass community level ways of coping from one generation to the next. So the next way, the second way that we can conceptualize the transmission of intergenerational trauma is through families. And so we see a lot of this in the family literature, the family studies literature. And so it may be helpful to pull on your understanding of attachment theory if you have that. There's also some really cool work from Robert Sapolsky, who is a biologist. The majority of his work has been with rats and with apes, but he is a scholar in the kind of stress world. He wrote the book, Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, or Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. He also has a really great podcast on UCity that I will link, where he talks about the biological mechanisms of stress. And so when we think about people who have been traumatized and how that changes the way that they engage with relationships, we can have a better understanding of how this can be transmitted at a family level. So often after traumatic events, individuals can feel numb or disconnected or out of control or irritable, fatigued, or a host of other symptoms. So in families where grandparents or parents have experienced a traumatic event, it's going to impact the coping skills and emotional regulation skills that are passed to the next generation. Right? Because a lot of what we learn is through modeling and through experience, especially with our primary caregivers. And so if our primary caregivers are functioning from a stress response, a trauma response space, right? Like those are what we are going to learn. I would also like to note that this applies to resiliency strategies too, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then the final way of conceptualizing intergenerational trauma is biologically. So from a genetic standpoint, researchers have found in a myriad of studies that children and individuals that have experienced large-scale traumas have similar biological signatures to their parents. So this research has included children whose mothers were pregnant during 9/11, children whose parents experienced the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, Japanese internment camps, and slavery. So when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we're not just talking about behavioral or community-based transmission across generation. It also appears that there's a very strong genetic predisposition to trauma response that can be passed between generations. This is largely due to epigenetics, which would mean that children would have a predisposition to responding a certain way to a traumatic event, but those predispositions need to be triggered by environmental factors. So this leaves space for therapeutic intervention to amend these patterns, right? Because we might not be able to amend the biological signatures, but we can amend the environmental factors, and we can put in place alternate ways of coping once we become aware of that. So I've included a list that you'll receive when you receive the follow-up survey after this presentation of articles on the transmission of trauma. And so this is going to include articles from a variety of fields on the theoretical and empirical understanding that we currently have about how this is transmitted across generations. So if this is a particular area of interest to you, or you want to dive into that a little bit deeper, you will have those resources. So next, let's shift to a little bit and briefly talk about personal trauma. So these are traumatic events that happen within a person's lifetime. So let's imagine we are working with a client who has a predisposition to respond to a traumatic event in a specific way due to intergenerational trauma. And one of those environmental factors is that they're exposed to additional traumas within their lifetime. So we want to think of intergenerational trauma as a foundation, potentially, that we were born with. And then over time, we have the potential of experiencing additional distress that will lay on top of and either reinforce or push against those patterns that are ingrained because of that intergenerational trauma. So there's 6 types of personal trauma that I'd like to talk about: individual, group, interpersonal, mass, developmental, and political and war. These are siloed off into discrete categories just for the purposes of ease. But of course, that's not how the world works. These are not really distinct categories, but this framework may be helpful when you're thinking about what may constitute a traumatic event and what type of response you may see from a client who's experienced that type of traumatic event. So the first one is individual trauma. And so these are going to be events that only one person experiences. So folks who experience individual traumas may not receive the environmental support or concern that people who experience a community or group trauma do, which inherently makes these traumas more isolating. So folks are less likely to talk about these experiences, potentially even recognize them as trauma, and may feel a lot of shame about them because it's just a very isolating, insulated experience for them. Physical injuries are actually the most common type of individual trauma. So this would be something like getting into a car accident where you're the only one in the car, or putting up your Christmas lights and falling off of a ladder and having to go into the hospital, right? Like injuries that will wind you up, engaging with the healthcare system in some way, shape, or form, or might have a lasting physical or psychological impact. So since physical injuries are one of the most one of the highest frequency types of this, it's really, really important that we ask about these to our clients to get a better understanding if potentially these are a traumatic experience that they had that they might not be recognizing as a trauma. The next one is going to be group trauma. And so group traumas often involve folks that have a similar identity, history, mission, or somewhat engage in the same type of activities. So you can see from that list, this may be first responders, military, doctors, nurses, individuals involved in gang violence. These folks are more likely to be exposed to repeated traumas as aspects of their work tend to keep them exposed to traumas. They also tend to keep these traumatic experiences insular, only discussing them with other members of the in-group. They may feel that outsiders don't understand, or potentially even intruders when we try to offer help when we don't identify as part of this group. For this group, it's really important that we have peer support as a part of supporting them, in addition to providing within group resources. So we might not be the person that's directly providing services, but we may be the person that hands it off to somebody else, right? Next, we have interpersonal traumas. And so these are traumatic incidents that happen between two people that know each other. These are typically the distinguishing factor in these is some level of relationship betrayal, like as a component of it, where a relationship that should have been safe is no longer safe. These types of traumas may have a very significant impact on people's ability to form and maintain relationships in the future if there isn't supportive intervention and helping people understand how this is impacting their way of coping and engaging in relationships. I also want to note that for this specific type of trauma, there is an incredible amount of resilience and strength seen in these survivors, and that can be a really deep well that we can draw on as practitioners. Often, much like the group traumas, these are ongoing. And so we tend to see folks that may have more complex trauma responses with these interpersonal traumas also. So next we have mass trauma, and these are events that often involve very large numbers of people and have a destruction of property component to them. So this is where we're supporting people that may not only need psychological support, but also need to have their basic needs attended to, in addition to the counseling support that we're providing. There also may be a disruption in normal routines and services, such as shutting down public transportation, banks, grocery stores, roads. So responding to these types of trauma often involves bringing people in outside of the community, because these types of traumas often rupture the infrastructure of a community to be able to support themselves. We already know that communities of color tend to be under-resourced to begin with. So these types of traumas can be very devastating and have very long impacts, especially if we see like an entire city gets a flood of help and is rejuvenated, and then we see a bunch of services being pulled out when the response has ended. We often see communities of color that started out kind of behind the starting line and end behind the starting line. Research on these types of traumas also states that one of the factors on how well people respond to these is how much time they have to recover before another trauma occurs, right? So if I'm experiencing a earthquake, right, the initial trauma may be the earthquake, and then a subsequent trauma may be that I go out and I realize that my primary form of transportation has also been crushed and destroyed. Then I realize that I don't have the insurance policy that I need to help me support, right? Like there's a compounding piece that happens here a lot with mass trauma. That makes it hard for people to bounce back, especially if it feels just like one thing is happening after another. So the next one is developmental trauma. There are specific events. So these are specific events that happen at a very specific developmental time and impact subsequent development. So typically these are referenced to things that happen in childhood, such as adverse experiences like abuse or neglect or high conflict divorce, or parents who are struggling with substance abuse. But we can also, I hope, broaden out our lens of development. I think I was just talking to my students about this last night, that oftentimes when we think about development, we think of like age 0 to 18, and then we're like, well, development's done. And hopefully with this crowd, with this division of the association, we understand that development is lifelong. So when we're talking about developmental trauma, we can also talk about things that happen to adults that seem to be outside of the normal developmental sequence. And so this could be like a child dying before their parent, right? Or this could be something like being diagnosed with a life-threatening illness at a young age, like as a young adult, right? So things that you are not expecting would be within the context of your development. We're going to have very significant changes to the trajectory. And then the last one is going to be political and war trauma. So all types of political trauma and war can have lasting impacts on everybody that's involved with it. Terrorism is a unique form of a human-caused type of political and war trauma. And what is distinguishing about terrorism as a subset of political and war trauma is that the point of terrorism is to maximize uncertainty, to maximize anxiety, and to create fear for a large portion of a community. Okay, and so when we start thinking about terrorism and what that is actually like hitting for us, that is like tapping directly into a biological component of us that pushes us immediately into self-preservation mode, right? So this also encompasses traumatic events that can coincide with the refugee experience. So leaving your home, not knowing the language or customs, having a hostile response to your present, having misinformation spread about your situation in the media or by community members. All of this creates a situation where we're leaving people fearing for their lives and uncertain about their future, which would all constitute a traumatic event. All right, take a sip of water. Okay. So now that we've covered the types of trauma, I want to spend a very short amount of time talking about the PTSD diagnosis. A lot of my students are in this presentation. I am so happy to see your faces here, and they have the wonderful pleasure of hearing me rant about this diagnosis often in our crisis and trauma class. Not everybody that experiences a traumatic event develops PTSD. And actually a very small number of people would probably meet full criteria as it's presented in the DSM. There are some historical reasons for this based on how the diagnosis was created, but that is beyond the scope of this presentation. But if that's something that's interesting to you, I'm more than happy to share that information about the historical underpinnings of our PTSD diagnosis. But for now, I just want to point out a couple of the unique aspects of this diagnosis and some of the issues that we have with it that may specifically impact communities of color. So the first piece about the PTSD diagnosis is that this is the only diagnosis that we have that part of the criteria for giving the diagnosis is knowing the cause, right? We don't have to know the cause of somebody's depression to diagnose them with depression. We don't have to know the cause of somebody's anxiety to diagnose them with anxiety. But for the PTSD diagnosis, per criteria A, we need to know what the traumatic event was to be able to diagnose them with PTSD. So this is why it's really important to be aware of the many different types of trauma and how we can connect those symptoms back to be able to properly diagnose a PTSD diagnosis. So even though the PTSD diagnosis has been very helpful in getting many individuals connected to effective treatment, there are also a lot of criticism to the diagnosis. The first one is that why are we pathologizing reactions that should be understood as appropriate coping responses to extremely stressful events? By putting the label on it, counselors have removed reactions from the appropriate scope, right? Like we've said that these are no longer appropriate and are labeling them as inappropriate or meeting a clinical level. So research doesn't support this criticism because there's enough data to show that some individuals react to the same stressor in very different ways, which means that we can have kind of an understanding of where those outliers lay. But this is one of kind of the beefs I have about broadly using that PTSD diagnosis, because we can have a client that has had a traumatic event and is totally coping in a rational way in response to that traumatic event. And I don't know if that necessarily would constitute PTSD. But it's when we have clients that have had a traumatic event and their way of coping seems to be so far removed from what is actually like an appropriate response to that traumatic event, that is when we get into clinical PTSD territory. One of the reasons people, the second one is that one of the reasons people think about the diagnosis and this like causal effect it has that we have that criterion A, is that we only use the diagnosis in legal matters because there's this causal relationship to the event. But even though trauma exposure is a prerequisite for the diagnosis, it's not enough to say that the individual has PTSD. So the exposure criteria is fundamental in personal injury litigation, but because exposure does establish liability or responsibility. There's no doubting that this diagnosis has been significantly abused by lawyers, but that doesn't diminish the diagnosis's clinical effectiveness. It's just something to keep in mind. The third is that there are people that take issue with this European American culture-bound component to it. So there are some culture-specific idioms of distress, but PTSD has been well documented throughout the world. And we have seen it well documented in a variety of different cultures. So yes, the way that we respond to traumas does tend to be in some way, shape, or form culture-bound, but the PTSD diagnosis has widespread international support. The fourth is that we have to use verbal reports of trauma exposure to provide the diagnosis. So for all DSM-5 diagnosis, this is one of the struggles that we have to rely on client verbal report. The world of counseling recognizes that this is an issue for all diagnosis and is just not specific to PTSD. And so even though it is an issue in all diagnosis, I don't think that throws kind of PTSD diagnosis out the window, that this is one of the pieces we need. And then the second one is this thought about traumatic memories, which has been like a a contentious point, like from the beginning of our profession with Freud, right? Like how valid are traumatic memories? So there's significant research to show that exposure to traumatic events does impact our ability to code memories, and that the retrieval of those memories can be impacted by our current state. That's not up for debate. We have research to prove that. But there are studies that show that when the information can be independently validated, traumatic memories tend to provide us an appropriate representation of the stressful event in question. Right. So when we do have that independent validation available, these memories tend to be relatively reliable from our clients. So this is not to say that some like quote unquote recovered memories are not accurate, and that it is possible to but it is possible to like lose a memory and have it retrieved. But we just want to make sure that when we're moving into this territory that we're using different validating techniques if we can to help us really understand our clients, their experience, to make sure that we have a deep understanding of it. All right, the biological components of trauma. I would be remiss if I didn't briefly talk about these biological components. So it's difficult to talk about trauma without talking about the impact it has on our bodies. Trauma is a cognitive, psychological, physiological experience that impacts our ability to regulate our emotions, to engage with others, and to function in our daily lives, and just complete personal tasks. Trauma stress cognitively impacts the way we view the world. So it can change us to us viewing the world as a dangerous place, or as a place where we can't trust anybody or other people. It impacts the way we view ourselves. So it can make us feel incompetent, and it can make us feel like the world is too much to handle. And it can impact the way that we view the future. It can make us feel like things will never be the same, or that our future is hopeless. So the body experiences stress, trauma, crisis as a whole system event. And the crisis and trauma experience pushes that system into a state of dysregulation. The response to the traumatic event, whatever that response is an adaptive response that's generating some form of relief. We don't keep things going if it's not serving some purpose. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about the coping skills. The body is doing what it has to do to sustain life and regulate by any means necessary. It's incredible, it's adaptive. And I really, really, really strongly encourage you to keep that information in your forefront when you're working with individuals with a history of trauma that might be presenting in front of you as erratic or rude or dangerous, or just a general display of destructive behavior, that their response is adaptive and they're doing the best they can to get their bodies regulated again. So I want you to think and challenge your clients to imagine what form of relief they're offering themselves in the way that they're acting, even if it's momentary. Okay. So let's start to dig deeper into coping. There are many ways to think about what may be impacting the way somebody responds to a traumatic event. It includes, but is definitely not limited to, individual attitudes, developmental factors, available resources, community reactions, life history, what has worked for them in the past, types of traumatic experience, the specific characteristics of the trauma. Was it a single event, an ongoing event, or what kind of cultural meaning they're making out of it? So when we think about trauma response and how to respond to somebody, we need to be looking holistically to better understand the many different factors that may be impacting how they perceive the traumatic event and how they respond to the traumatic event. So like I mentioned earlier, when we're talking about intergenerational trauma, we're really talking about intergenerational trauma responses and or traumatic incidents that have been so pervasive and destructive that they change future generations. So with those intergenerational trauma wounds comes intergenerational ways of coping with them. And so I think it's a really important piece here for our clients to talk about not good and bad ways of coping, but talking about healthy or unhealthy, or effective and ineffective, or less effective and more effective, right? There is no good or bad in this land that we're talking about of biology. We're talking about healthy, unhealthy, effective, ineffective here. So in some cases, we're talking about a way of coping that was intentionally used to manage a real threat. And then is now being used by future generations to manage both real and perceived threats. So my body has a game plan that it learned from my great-great-grandmother who lived through enslavement and passed down ways of coping with oppression, being taken advantage of, and the felt experience of being perpetually unsafe. I have that baked into my DNA. The body remembers what it needed to do to survive that and passes it down. That's like sacred knowledge that's used to help ensure the survival of future generations, right? It's baked into us. So how exactly does this work? So I have two images that I use with clients that I think helps see exactly how this process works. So this cone can be used to help clients track their ways of coping across either generations or across a lifetime. So it all starts with a first traumatic incident. So something happens and we have a millisecond to decide how to respond to it. We do the best we can to adapt to it and survive, and the body remembers that. So then another incident happens that elicits the same stress response system. The body doesn't have a cognitive way to distinguish between these events, but remembers the felt sense of being unsafe and immediately pulls what has worked in the past. So we adapt and survive through the second incident, but we have slightly broadened out the types of incidents that our body feels like this way of coping can be used for. So then we move through life crisis events that triggers that same system. And the body says, hey, I know what works with these types of events, and throws the same way of coping at it. And it worked once, so it'll work again. Then we broaden it out even further. The body can't differentiate between actual threats and threats to our way of life. This is why we see people experience like a true terror response when they perceive someone who's different from them coming in and changing their way of life. And we throw the same coping skill out. And then up the chain we go until we get to a point where we're using a coping skill that we created for a very specific extreme event on a minor inconvenience. And we wonder why it isn't working or why it isn't healthy. This is how numbing to be psychologically and physically survive an assault becomes an everyday experience, right? We take a very extreme incident and we take a coping skill that was adaptive for that. And then we slowly but surely across our lifetime or generations broaden it out to use it. So this is how ways of coping become ingrained across generations or across a lifetime. Because we never stop to think, where did this come from and what was the original purpose? Another way of explaining it is this, as another figure that I use with my clients, is when we first create a way of coping, it typically pretty well matches the triggering incident. But over time, the triggering incident changes and we pull out the same way of coping. It works well enough for us to keep using it, but it doesn't actually match the situation. This is how getting angry and fighting back against somebody who's physically abusive to you turns into road rage at a minor incident, or punching your boss when they tell you to do something, right? Like we had a way of responding to a very specific incident, and then we have the same felt sense and we keep pulling that out. The further the coping skill gets away from the situation it was initially meant to use, the less effective it gets unless we're intentional about assessing what's working in that situation and what's not. our body will stay on autopilot and keep using it because it's more efficient to use something that's 50% effective than to try something completely new that might not be effective at all. So unless we're intentional about introducing new ways of coping, our body will always, always, always err on the side of survival, even if it has to overshoot. All right, I want to be mindful of my time because I'm a talker. Even with notes, I was like, oh yeah, this is easy breezy. I'll get this into 60 minutes. So talking about trauma-informed care and trauma-specific care, and I'm gonna speed up this part a little bit so that we can get to the coping pieces at the end. So there's a difference between trauma-informed and trauma-specific care. It is realistic that every clinician should be trauma-informed, but we don't necessarily need to be trained in trauma-specific ways. So being trauma-informed means that you keep these four principles in mind. You have an understanding of trauma and how it impacts people. You are able to look at trauma through an ecological and cultural developmental lens. You're vigilant in anticipating and avoiding ways of re-traumatizing your clients, and you uphold client participation in every aspect of delivery. One of the primary features of traumatic events is it makes people feel disempowered and unsafe. What we want to do is we want to be as predictable, transparent, and safe as possible to our clients, all clients. And that's what being trauma-informed is. Now, if we have a client who is needing trauma-specific care, there's a myriad of trauma-specific ways that they can be worked with, and the vast majority of these are going to require advanced training, supervision, ways of learning to work with them. There's a lot of different research on different types of trauma-specific ways of working. Typically, these are going to align with your base theoretical orientation. So if you're drawn to cognitive theories, you might love trauma CBT. If you're drawn to body-based theories, you might love EMDR, right? Like, depending on what your base theory is, you'll probably find a trauma-specific way to work with your clients that aligns with that. All right, strength and resilience. So when we're working with our clients of color, we want to make sure that we're looking at the adversities that they've experienced over time and thinking, wow, you are creative, adaptive, resilient, right? We want to be pulling on personal strengths of our clients, how they've managed to adapt to extreme situations. We want to really lean into bolstering their areas of competency. We want to validate any emotional or behavioral response they're having to these incidents, pulling on relationships, and then going back to culture as a way of finding strength for our clients. The capacity for resilience is innate, but the skill of resilience is learned. So we want to make sure that we're helping our clients build the skill of resilience, not just assuming that we're all born to be resilient and we're all going to bounce back from whatever the world throws at us, because that's just not a realistic expectation. We need to learn how to pull from our culture, how to pull from our personal experience, how to pull from what our counselor has told us to become resilient. All right, the last couple pieces, and then I will try to hit on a couple questions. So the clinical implications of this, when we're working with communities of color, you need to have a historical understanding, right? You just have to. You have to do the work. You need to have a historical understanding and an understanding of recent events so that you can put ways of coping into context. It's important to understand that any PTSD scale that you use is going to be really good at capturing the big T traumas, but it was never meant to capture the little T traumas. Communities of color may not recognize experiences of racism as trauma or their ways of responding to it as a stress response. And so you can start by just talking about the biology of trauma and stress as a way of normalizing experiences and reactions. And then racial and cultural trauma actually straddles the line between intergenerational and personal trauma. So it can be really important to talk with your clients about the intergenerational implications of racial and cultural trauma and how that's impacting the way that they respond to in their lifetime experiences of racial or cultural trauma. There are lots and lots and lots of different scales to assess race-based trauma. I've put a bunch here. This list was actually compiled by Dr. Monica Williams, who has a pretty great PESI training out right now on racial trauma. So if that's an area of interest to you, that may be a place that you seek out more information from. But there's lots and lots of different scales that you can use. So step one, when we're working with communities of color, is that we're always going to be coming from a trauma-informed lens. We can help them process racial incidents by putting the blame back on the perpetrator and validating feelings. This is not the time for Socratic questioning or for looking at alternative ways to explain the incidents. Not the time. Where we are purely shifting the blame onto the perpetrator in these incidents and helping people understand that they did nothing to elicit these racial experiences. Counselor, know thyself. Know your own cultural history, know how you experience people that are different from you. Helping your client name it to tame it. I use that all the time with my clients. Let's put a name on it. Let's talk about where it came from. And once we have that, we can tame it a little bit better. And then helping them draw a connection between their ways of coping, the purpose that coping serves, and what's working and not working. And then cultural humility. If that's a new term for you, I strongly suggest you look up the literature on it. It's a great way to think about how working with other cultures. The multiphasal model is also a model that intentionally integrates cultural empowerment and indigenous healing and social justice into the way that you do therapy. So if you're looking for a model to follow, that might make this a little bit easier to work with clients who are different from you, then that you can look up its use in this article to have a better understanding of it. So next steps for you. Here are some of the resources that I talked about throughout the presentation. Dr. Monica Williams has been doing a lot of work in racial trauma assessments and treatment techniques. There are some articles, and then there's also a PESI training that she has out right now that's pretty good. There's a really good a book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resma. That talks about intergenerational trauma and the body-based implications of that. And then if you're interested in the stress component of it, Dr. Robert Sapolsky is probably the person I would turn to. And this is the book I mentioned, and then also the talk that he gave that some of you might find interesting. All right. So I thank you all so much. I deeply apologize. I didn't leave a ton of time for questions, but I will take questions in these last couple minutes. And if you are doing a presentation coming up on race or intergenerational trauma and you want to promote your work, put it in the chat. Let us know what you all are doing. We'd love to hear a little bit more about what this community has to offer and help support you when you're doing your talks too.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Adams, for that. It was a wonderful presentation, and I certainly learned so much from you. And I know our attendees are also thankful for your presentation. One thing that we can do, I did collect some of the questions from the chat. One thing that we can do is I can send those to you, and you can type them out, and we can include those with the survey as well. So we can get some of your answers that way. So that'll be cool. So the questions will still be answered, but they will come to you when we send out your survey for your CE NBCC clock hour. So on behalf of the Association for Adult Development and Aging, I would like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, those that did use a telephone to call in, please email the AADA email account with your full name and number so you can be marked as attending today. In the chat, I just dropped a link for an upcoming webinar. Our next webinar, it will be in collaboration with the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development, entitled Promoting Multiracial Solidarity, Conversations for Healing Black and Asian Communities. This webinar will be a panel discussion with Dr. Christian D. Chan, Dr. Kimley Hughes, Dr. Stacy Lydham and Dr. Rufus Tony Spann, moderated by myself. The panel discussion does not offer a NBCC clock hour, but it is a wonderful opportunity to learn about racial solidarity and healing. It'll certainly be a riveting discussion. It is free to register, and registration is currently open. So again, click that link that I put in the chat and register. You can encourage your students, your peers, et cetera. It is open to everyone in the community to come and learn. And so additionally, we do have another AADA webinar that will have 1.5 NBC clock hours with that on the topic of chronic sorrow with Dr. Tiffany Bordonado on March 24, 2021 from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So please be on the lookout for that registration through AADA emails, or you can follow the AADA Eventbrite that you use to register for today's webinar, and all that information will be coming to you. So within 3 days of this presentation, which again, Dr. Adams, thank you, it was wonderful. You all will receive an evaluation link. And so please complete that no later than 2 weeks from today. And then you will receive your CE certificates via email. I want to thank you all again for attending and encourage you to have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, Dr. Adams.
You're welcome. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.